I think that bodybuilding is one of those sports which has to be approached as a process. And I think that all too often, young people are in a hurry. They're in a hurry to go from amateur to professional. And I just keep hearing the amateurs talking about getting their pro card. Well, let me tell you, that process used to take years and years and years back when I was coming up through the amateur ranks, and rightly so. And every year they would literally pick a small handful. And when I say a small handful, probably less than 5 new pros every year. It was that difficult. But by the time that you were ranked as a professional, you were ready to step on the stage at a Mr. Olympia. You were that good. And so I think that we've lost something along the way. You know, I think that pro cards are given out too easily these days. And I think that what happens is that these amateurs, however good they are to win a pro card, they are not nearly good enough to compete in a professional bodybuilding show. And they find themselves as an entry-level pro with a number of years ahead of them, 5, 10 years or more, before they can be competitive, if they're ever competitive, at that next level. And to me, that's a little bit disheartening, you know, because you basically cheat yourself out of the joy of the process. You know, so the joy of basically improving your physique from year to year to year. So the best advice I can give you is, if you're an amateur, don't be in a hurry to climb the ranks. Make sure that you can excel and win easily at one level before you go to the next level. So when I won my professional status by winning the IFBB Mr. Universe, I was also working full-time as a structural engineer, designing high-voltage transmission line structures. It was a Spartan life at best, you know. So literally working from 8 in the morning until 5 p.m., going home and getting into my gym clothes, going to the gym, working out for a couple of hours, going back home, you know, doing some food shopping, cooking for myself, eating, going to sleep, and rinse and repeat time after time after time. So discipline really played a big part in my success there, you know. But it's one of those things that you have to do. And so I was supporting myself, you know, from something outside of bodybuilding. And so once I won the IFBB Mr. Universe, I didn't waste any time. You know, I sent out information to all of the NPC promoters across the country, letting them know about my availability for guest posing and guest appearances and that type of thing. And then I started lining those up for the following spring. And by the time the spring came around, I had enough work lined up for the rest of the year that I could transition from being an engineer full time to being a bodybuilder full time. You know, and so that's a bit of a leap of faith, you know, but it worked in my case. And I still remember my dad, who was an engineer himself, asking me if I couldn't do both at the same time. And so, you know, to be honest, you know, I went from engineering structures to engineering my body, you know. But I was always very careful, you know, in planning next steps and making sure that I had an income. After I made the transition from engineering to professional bodybuilding, I was fully committed. You know, in other words, I knew in my heart that I was never going to go back to engineering. So having that commitment, you know, it's kind of like the mentality of burning the ships. You know, that old story about the commander that brought his his ancient army via a ship to the shores of another country and told them to burn the ships. And when asked why, is because you're not going back. Okay, so you basically have to win the battle at hand because the ships are burned. You can't go back. You know, and so that's a heck of an incentive, right? And so it was really no different for me. I was just bound and determined to be able to make my living from professional bodybuilding. As far as what other people thought about whether that was a legitimate career or not, it never really even crossed my mind, because in my heart I knew it was, and I don't care what other people think. Once I put my mind to something and I am determined to achieve it, then if you don't have anything positive to say, then you have no place, in that scenario. So I just forged ahead and did the best that I could. It was challenging, in terms of making money. Fortunately, I was one of these guys that was good enough to be at the top of their sport, because this is something that's true even to this day, that, unless you're like one of the top 5 or 10 in the world, it is hand to mouth. Okay. It is not something that pays like, being a superstar in the NFL or the NBA or another major professional sport. It's tough. Today we've got social media, and of course, you have the eyes of the world on you at all times. That goes not just for the bodybuilding champions and the superstars, but for the up-and-comers and even those that haven't competed. Some have a tremendous social media following because there's something that's interesting to their followers, and that's why they follow them. Back in the days in which I was competing, as I mentioned before, the only form of media was the bodybuilding magazines. And so you had Muscle and Fitness, you had Flex, you had Muscular Development, Muscle Mag, Iron Man. And if you were featured in those magazines on a month-to-month basis, then that was the equivalent of our social media back in the day. But you were very limited. The number of people that were featured in those magazines were very limited only to the champions at the time. So those were coveted slots, and not everybody got a chance to be in the limelight. So, it was a blessing, but at the same time, there was a very narrow gate to go through it to reach that point.